Okay, it looks like we're live. Hi, everyone. My name is Danielle Snowflack. I am back for our fourth biotechnology live stream. We're happy again to be bringing this training, this lesson into your home. And this workshop is going to be a little different than the last three. Today, we're actually going to be focusing on environmental science and the ways that biotechnology can play a role in environmental science. And I think what you'll find is that biotechnology is a major player in environmental science in ways that we can actually affect climate change for the better. And so I know many of you have joined us before, but just to give you a little bit of introduction as to us at Edvotek, we are the biotechnology education company. We were founded over 30 years ago by Dr. Jack Churchian, a professor of biochemistry at Georgetown University. Now, this was a super exciting time for biotechnology. If you look back at the scientific literature from the time, we were in the heyday of some of these molecular biology techniques when they came to light. So, molecular cloning and the development of restriction enzymes as tools to cut DNA. We can use this DNA for genetic engineering to make genetically engineered plants, and those are going to play a big role in environmental biotechnology, but we'll get to that a little bit later. PCR was developed in the 1980s. This is a technique used to amplify millions of copies of DNA from a small starting material. So these were super exciting Nobel Prize winning techniques, but very little of this was being translated into the classroom. And so that's where Edvotek came into play. Edvotek was born to bring in biotechnology innovation to the teaching classroom. And so our focus is on the education sphere, on ways that we can bring in cutting edge biotechnology to the teaching classroom. We work with educators all over the world to demystify science and to foster the next generation of scientists through hands-on active learning activities. So today's experiment, like I mentioned, is a climate change experiment. So we are, now I'm sure you're very familiar with our biotech experiments. If you're here, you probably already know about Edvotek, or you may have used an Edvotek experiment or been on one of our other live streams. But biotech is a huge part of environmental science and in developing strategies that we can use to address environmental issues. And so today we're going to focus on ways that we can visualize climate change. And throughout the talk, I'll discuss actions that we can take to reduce our environmental impact and real-world biotechnology that is being used to address environmental issues. And I'll highlight a few STEM careers that you or your students may be interested in to be able to address environmental issues. And so, I didn't change the slide, or I think I advanced back, but that's okay. This is the experiment we're running. Today's experiment is Edvotek Kit 930. Invisible footprints, seeing carbon dioxide and understanding climate change. This experiment models the carbon cycle and climate change using colorful personal atmospheres. When those are what you see in this picture, these little tubes are our personal atmospheres. In an extension activity that we include pools the student atmospheres, our individual atmospheres, to look at community effects on climate. So not only looking at climate at the individual level, but the local, regional, global level. And so this demonstration is going to be recorded and our slides will be available on the website. So if you'd like to be notified when they're posted, please fill out this form. This form is going to be in the link in the chat box. So let's get started with a couple of important definitions. And I know for me, a big part of really understanding what climate change was, it was understanding the difference between climate and weather. And I know oftentimes they are thought of as being interchangeable, and they are definitely related and they depend on one another. But in truth, they are two different concepts. So weather is going to refer to short-term events in the atmosphere. Although the Earth only has one atmosphere, different areas of the atmosphere will have different weather effects that are happening in the same 24-hour period. So this is the difference between a sunny day in Maryland and a rainy day in New Jersey. Local air pressure, humidity, wind, temperature, all affect day-to-day weather. Even extreme storms like hurricanes and blizzards and tornadoes, these are all parts of the normal weather in a particular region. Now, climate is referring to weather trends over a long period in a specific region. So if we're talking about Maryland, this would be looking at Maryland for the past 30 years, not just for the past 30 days. These are average temperatures over time, average rainfall, average snowfall. We look at weather over time and calculate and use decades of observations to determine what a region's climate is like. And so I love this graphic from the National Centers for Environmental Information from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. And that's the graphic that's in this slide. This analogy really hits home for me in terms of the differences between climate and weather. So weather is akin to what you're putting on today, your seasonal wardrobe. We're just at the beginning of summer here in Maryland. And so I've been trading in sweaters and long pants for tank tops, shorts, and sandals. We're still gonna have cold days where I might need to break out the jeans. And we'll definitely have days where I'm gonna need a raincoat and an umbrella. But most days it's safe to assume that it's gonna be warm and sunny. Now, I'm not going to get rid of my winter clothes. They'll get moved to the back of my closet for now. It's part of my seasonal wardrobe. And that's where climate comes into place. So I know from data from my past 8 years of living here in Maryland, that it's going to get cold again in the fall and in the winter. And at that point, I will need to change my wardrobe again. The average fall temperatures in Maryland are too cold for me to continue wearing shorts and t-shirts. And so that cyclical change and the knowledge of what you're going to need in terms of the clothes in your closet, this is climate, the long-term implications of our day-to-day weather. And so we're lucky because in general, we inhabit a comfortable planet. We have ocean currents, the water cycle, survival of animals and ecosystems, and many elements of modern-day human life are all possible due to because the Earth's temperatures stay within a certain range. Through thousands of years of evolution, life has adapted to live pretty much anywhere on our planet, from cacti in our deserts to penguins at the South Pole. We have bacteria living in the depths of the ocean, and we have humans living here as well. Now, humans are unique in that we have developed strategies to exist in most parts of the planet. We live all over the planet. Not through evolution necessarily, but through the creation of shelters, of indoor temperature control, different clothing, both warm and cool, and more. But these changes, these innovations are not without impact on our planet. So, Earth's cozy temperature are due to a group of gases called greenhouse gases. However, these gases, in particular carbon dioxide, are increasing rapidly. And so this is causing higher temperatures overall, which is changing our climate. So changing that long-term trend of weather. Because climate change is a major challenge to the environment and to society, we need to limit our carbon dioxide emissions by creating new energy habits and systems. This will require understanding, innovation, and action both at the local and global levels. However, small changes add up, and we will be exploring that in this lesson. So let's talk about carbon. Carbon is an abundant and versatile element. The chemical properties of carbon are, wide-reaching and varied depending on what molecules we're talking about. And so carbon itself can bond with itself and other elements in various ways to allow for a great variety of great diversity in carbon-containing compounds. So in this picture, you see over here, we have two different kinds of carbon-containing compounds, graphite and diamonds. So graphite is black and opaque, while diamonds are clear and colorless. When polished correctly, they are beautifully reflective. Graphite is soft. It's used as the lead in our pencils. And so if we were to take this chunk of graphite or take a pencil and stick it across a piece of paper, we're going to leave a mark. In contrast, diamond is the hardest naturally occurring material known. It's often used on drill bits to bore holes through glass and stones like granite and marble. And so these are two very different compounds that are related because they're both made with the same starting material, carbon. And so carbon actually will interact with other elements to create many different chemical compounds. So in the air, we actually see carbon as part of the atmosphere, which is that layer of gases that surrounds the Earth. While in the atmosphere, carbon will usually bond with hydrogen to form methane or with oxygen to form carbon dioxide. And these two molecules, along with a handful of other gases, have unique structures that allow them to trap heat into the earth that would otherwise escape into space. So we can think about this heat trapping process. This heat trapping process is called the greenhouse effect. And we can think about it like a greenhouse. So like the panes of a greenhouse, these gases allow energy from the sun to enter the Earth's atmosphere. So if we're thinking about a greenhouse, the sun's light is coming to the greenhouse through the panes of glass. These panes of glass are going to allow the energy to come through, but block heat from escaping. And so this layer of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere also blocks heat from escaping. And this keeps our planet at a temperature which allows life to thrive. So, and then let's think further about life on our planet. Everything is dependent on carbon. So carbon is found in the oceans, the air we breathe, rocks, the soil, and in all living things. The chemical structure of our very DNA is dependent on carbon. Our proteins, our carbohydrates, all use carbon as a building block. But importantly, carbon is dynamic and can move easily through all these different areas in which it's used, from the land to the sea to the air to our bodies to our food. Carbon atom can be part of a plant one day, an animal the next, and then travel downstream to the ocean or up in the air. The continuous movement of carbon through our environment is called the carbon cycle, and it's essential for life on this planet. Now, as I mentioned before, the presence of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is critical to keep our planet at a temperature where life can thrive. Carbon dioxide enters the atmosphere when plants and animals respire, when volcanoes erupt, organic matter decays or it's burnt, and when this gas is released by the ocean. It leaves the atmosphere when carbon dioxide is used by plants during photosynthesis or when the gas dissolves into the ocean. Because these processes are dynamic, atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations are constantly changing on a yearly, monthly, even daily basis. So two major drivers of the current increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide come from the burning of fossil fuels and major land changes. So fossil fuels are the buried remains of plants and animals that lived thousands of years ago. They include petroleum, coal, oil, natural gas. And we use these fuels. These fuels are very important, in many ways for our success as human beings. They fuel our factories, our cars. We use them as power. We burn them to create electricity. Which is, responsible for hosting this very webinar. It's a major factor. They were a major factor in the Industrial Revolution in allowing us to create goods at a large scale. And so we have to remember that our society is partially a result of having access to these powerful energy stores. However, the use of fossil fuels also moves carbon that was previously stored for millions of years underground into the atmosphere, where it's profoundly altered the carbon cycle. So we're releasing so much more carbon into the atmosphere than we did before we started using these fuels. At the same time, we're also modifying the Earth's surface. As I mentioned, humans we build houses to shelter ourselves instead of having, evolutionary adaptations necessarily. We grow our food, whether it's plants or animals. So we're cutting down trees to have farms. We're building and we're creating parking lots where there once was marshland, and these are problems for the environment, because compared to the original forest, the wetlands, grasslands, these new landscapes have a lowered capacity to absorb carbon, and this has changed the carbon cycle. So as more carbon enters into or is stored by the atmosphere, the greenhouse effect is becoming stronger. And this is going to play an effect on our environment and our climate. So this figure is going to describe many of the environmental consequences of climate change, including rising sea levels and ocean acidification, loss of biodiversity due to ecological shifts in regions where animals have evolved to live, and the increase in extreme weather events, including hurricanes, heat waves, blizzards, and droughts. So these changes don't affect everyone equally. They're going to be different, again, from country to country, even, within our own country. You can look at individuals living on the coasts may be affected by too much water due to rising water levels. And so these water levels can come from the melting of the polar ice caps, which is going to raise the water levels. And so too much water is a problem coastally. But if we're looking at farmers in the Midwest, the problem might be drought, which is going to affect the growth of their crops. So they have too little water, where coastal populations have too much water. However, as the effects of global warming continue to intensify, the costs of society are going to grow and affect everybody. So if we think about that farmer who might not be able to plant or harvest his crops, that food supply is then going to affect the person living coastally as well. And so, environment, it is a global problem, and all the environments are in all the different areas are going to depend on one another to combat this problem. So let me change my view, and let's talk about what we need to perform this experiment. So first, I am going to put on gloves. This is a safe experiment. All of the reagents that we're using are safe for classroom use. Nothing is hazardous or toxic, but it's always best form to use proper personal protective equipment. I don't have a picture of them here, or actually I do have them here. We are going to have, each student is going to answer questionnaires. Here's mine. You can see that I put some of my answers in here. So we have questionnaires for carbon footprint and for the carbon handprint. So that's our positive and our negative, or negative and our positive impacts on the environment through our carbon outtake. And these questionnaires allow students to address their impact on the climate in ways that they can address these issues. Now, I'm going to be honest, there are social and economic implications to these questions. We've tried to create our questions sensitively so that we can de-emphasize these differences, but if a student is uncomfortable with answering these questions, you can have the student answer the questions as a fictional character. And so I'll be modeling my own carbon consumption, but we're also going to be using the fictional example of James Bond as a second student in our class. So we're also going to have these CO2 drops, and I'll explain more about what they are later. Now I have them here in a big jar. And so basically this CO2 drop is going to simulate our, oh gosh, you can't even really see it. But here would be the vial that the powder came in. So we supply this reagent as a powder. You dilute it when you get home in water. These drops are going to simulate our greenhouse gas simulations. More drops equals more CO2 emissions. Fewer equals less carbon dioxide in the environment. We are going to have personal atmospheres. So these are going to be the way that we can visualize our personal climates, our personal atmospheres, and our visual representation of our effects on the atmosphere. So we have one for myself, and we have one for James Bond. And then we also are going to have a classroom atmosphere. So we're going to pool our samples. So this is going to allow us to look at not only our individual effects on the climate through our personal samples, but also to look at our community effects on the atmosphere, the effects of a population on the environment. We have a color change solution, and this is going to actually be the reagent that changes color to allow us to gauge how much carbon dioxide we are putting into our personal and our classroom environment. We have a mitigation solution. It comes in a small tube that you will dilute in your classroom. And I just want to make the point of saying, we do provide a lot of these as concentrates. It makes it easier for us to ship, which is one way that Edvotek is actually taking care of the environment, through providing concentrated reagents so that we're not shipping huge boxes. We're instead shipping small tubes that can then be diluted at home. Finally, we are going to need to transfer the samples and reagents. There are a few ways we can do this. One is a plastic transfer pipette. So I have two sizes here that I'll be using. And you can also use an adjustable volume micropipette, which is a precision tool that we use to measure small volumes. To simplify today's demonstration, I am going to just use the transfer pipette. So we can run this experiment without any special equipment. Again, I've been doing all these workshops in my basement with a minimal of equipment. So if I can do them here, you can do them in your classroom, not a problem. All right, so let's talk about carbon footprints. So carbon footprints are going to characterize our negative impact on the environment. And so in discussions about climate change, you may have heard this term. In this context, footprint is the metaphor for the total impact that something has, and carbon is a shorthand for all greenhouse gas emissions that are causing climate change. Let me just put our environments down here so there's something in the screen. And so the carbon footprint calculations are a tool used by individuals, groups, companies, and even nations to examine and better understand our impact on climate, the climate. The calculations are going to address questions like, how much carbon dioxide do I release into the atmosphere? Do we as a society release into the atmosphere? What actions are responsible for these emissions? And what can we change? So we can measure this as a carbon dioxide equivalent, or CO2e. This metric describes greenhouse gas emissions by converting other gas emissions to CO2 amounts that would have the same global warming impact. And so this pie graph that we have up here on this slide shows each country's share of the yearly CO2 emissions. So what you'll notice is that each country is going to emit different levels of CO2. This is from the combustion of fossil fuels, industrial waste, municipal waste, transportation, and so on. What you'll see is that after China, the US is the second largest producer of CO2 emissions. So per capita, that is taking into account the population of the country, the United States ranks fourth. So while reducing the release of greenhouse gases has to happen at home in our own personal lives, and also in our own country, across the United States, if we're thinking about, again, manufacturing, municipal waste, etc., we really need to partner with our global neighbors to decrease these carbon dioxide emissions and to implement strategies to increase the use of green technologies and produce green energy. So some of our actions are easier to connect to emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, such as driving or heating a building, and others are harder. For example, the electricity that most people purchase is from local suppliers who can use different methods with different emissions to create this energy. Even more complicated is incorporating items that we buy, like groceries, clothing, or cars, into our carbon footprint. And so one example that we can use is a water bottle. And so let's look at this water bottle. Every stage of this item's production is going to reduce carbon dioxide, from the petroleum used to make the plastic and manufacture the bottle, to shipping the water across the country, or even from country to country. I think Evian is French. And then we have to get rid of we'll drink the water, and then we have to get rid of the waste. Hopefully through recycling, which is going to be the reuse of the plastic, and not by putting it in the trash can, which is going to go to a landfill. Now, if you drink 1 3-liter bottle of water per day, those carbon emissions are really going to add up. However, we can reduce our carbon footprint by using a reusable water bottle. Now, there is a cost to manufacturing the water bottle, to shipping it to your home. There's the truck that's got to get it to the store, then you drive to the store. So, these aren't without having an impact, but you're buying the bottle once. You're not buying 3 bottles per day. You're filling it with water from your tap 3 times per day. And so this is a small way that we can begin to make a change and to take the environment into account. So let's visualize our carbon footprints. First, we would fill out the carbon footprint questionnaire and use our numbers to calculate the number of CO2e drops that we're going to add. So I've already added the drops to James Bond's atmosphere, so we're not going to worry about that one. But I am going to add the carbon drops to my own personal atmosphere. Now, I've actually, if you look at my carbon footprint, and I did the questionnaire, I need to add about 166 drops of atmosphere to this tube. And so I've actually pre-measured them already because I didn't want to have to sit here, and I'm sure you don't want to have to watch me count 166 drops. It's much easier for me to have the drops and pre-measured in a microcentrifuge tube here and just add them to my atmosphere. So it is easier if I do this off camera. So I'm going to add these drops. Once the drops are added, I am going to cap the tube and invert it. So, as I mentioned, I filled out the questionnaire and I calculated the number of drops. We filled out a questionnaire for James Bond. He's got a pretty high carbon footprint. I imagine all that spying, between the fancy cars and the jet-setting lifestyle and excessive consumption is going to give him a higher carbon footprint with 245 drops. Now you can pick you can actually, if you want to, you can figure out a more environmentally friendly person as well, and use them as an example. And so you could have a high consumer and a low consumer. All right, here's mine. I've mixed it. So we're going to use these as our own personal atmospheres. The next step is that I am going to transfer 1.5 ml of my personal atmosphere into a marked microcentrifuge tube. And so this is going to be the sample that we are going to use to analyze our impact on the climate. So this is a small representation of my personal atmosphere. All right, I'm going to cap up my bigger atmosphere. All right, so we have my sample. We have James's sample here, which again I removed from that larger tube. And then we have the original sample. So this third sample, which I've labeled O, is our original sample. So that's the environment without any additional carbon added to it. So that's going to be our baseline. And so what I'm going to do, we transferred 1 ml to a clean 1.5 ml tube. I'm going to add 3 to 4 drops of our color change solution to each of these tubes. And the color change is going to be indicative of the amount of environmental impact that we're having. So let's start with our original environment. So you can see I'm adding the drops. I'm going to invert it a couple times to mix. So that's our original environment. Here is going to be my personal atmosphere. And what you can see is that the colors change. So this is an impact of my carbon footprint. And then we're going to add James's sample and see the color change. And what you can see is we have 3 different colored samples here. And each of these colored samples is going to represent a different amount of carbon footprints. Let's move to the next slide. And so, sorry, there's James Bond. I forgot I had that picture there. So yeah, there's my lab mate. And we are going to examine our effects on the environment. And so if we look here, what we can do is we can see our individual atmospheres. So what you can see is our original atmosphere has a lower carbon dioxide load. So we can see that it's a brighter green color. That's going to represent about 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide. If we were to look at the the level of carbon present in 2050. And so if we stay at those levels, we would see about a 1.5 degree Celsius increase in temperature over time. And it doesn't seem like a lot, but every degree is going to count in terms of the environment and impacting climate change. If we look at mine, mine is higher than I wish it would be sometimes. We all, especially at this time, I'm probably just as guilty as anyone, is buying a lot of stuff online. And that stuff, it comes at a cost, both manufacturing, shipping, etc. So my sample is kind of an intermediate sample. You could see it's yellow. And if everybody were to produce it if everyone were to use it that level, by 2050, we would see a 3 degree increase. Now, if we were all James Bond, what you can see is that we have that bright red sample. That bright red sample is a very high level of consumption. And it's going to be indicative of, a high carbon use lifestyle. And that change, it's pretty dramatic. And so that person, while probably the travel is part of the job, they could look to reduce their carbon emissions a bit. And so I also mentioned we are going to be looking at the effects on the classroom population. So I have another microstudy. What I did while I was talking is I mixed a couple mils of James Bond's personal atmosphere with a couple mils of my personal atmosphere. And so that's going to be looking at us as a population, as all of us together. And what you can see, I mixed them together. I put them in a 1.5 mil centrifuge tube. And what you can see is that we're going to get kind of an intermediate color. So between mine and James Bond's. So you can see that all of our our cumulative changes, between people who are being careful to reduce their carbon footprint versus people who are being more wasteful, it's going to average out to something intermediate. Okay, so but one thing I want to point out is that there are weaknesses to carbon footprints. So they really only focus on the negative impacts of an individual or a group. This is only half of the picture. Every day, people are positively addressing climate change through changing their habits, through innovation, and through cooperation. Carbon handprints are a way to describe and quantify actions that lead to climate change mitigation. So ways that we can actually try to improve the climate and to reduce the amount of carbon we're putting into the environment. So similar to the footprints, every individual, group, business, and nation is going to have a carbon handprint. The major ways that an individual can grow their carbon handprint, so ways that we can reduce our carbon output, are by reducing and modeling energy conservation, by educating other people about the causes and consequences of climate change, through inventing and finding new energy solutions and efficient energy use, and also by promoting climate change solutions at the local, national, and even at the global level. And so as scientists, we believe that biotechnology tools can be used to combat climate change. There are a lot of applications of biotechnology to environmental causes, and as a whole, we call this green biotechnology. And there are many different implementations of green biotechnology today, and more being dreamed up for future use. So, biotechnology can help us reduce the energy needed for farming with genetically modified plants. And now this workshop isn't going to cover the ethics of genetically modified plants. We as scientists think that they are an incredibly important tool that can be used for agriculture to address many issues in farming and in climate. And so if we think about Roundup Ready crops, they are herbicide tolerant. So these crops are actually going to help us environmentally. Since we don't need to till the soil regularly to keep the weeds down, we can reduce the loss of soil due to erosion. And so we're not releasing all that carbon back into the water supply. We are able to keep this healthy, strong soil with lots of nutrients in place. Insect-resistant crops are going to reduce the amount of pesticides that you need to spray. So an example of this is BT corn. So this is going to save fuel because the plant is making its own pesticide. This is going to save the fuel necessary for tractors or airplanes to spread a pesticide. And it's also very species specific. So for example, if we're talking about BT corn, the BT protein is only going to affect a few different insect species, and they're the ones that prey on corn. Whereas a general pesticide that we might spray can affect a lot of beneficial insects in the area, pollinators that are really important for crop growth and for the natural biodiversity of an area. Furthermore, we can make drought-resistant crops that survive better with less water. That means if we are in a drought condition, we're not going to lose an entire growing season's worth of food. So if you want to explore this more, we do have several experiments that would allow you and your students to explore genetically modified crops and to discuss the ethics of genetic modification. And so talking about the environment is definitely one of the ethical points that you can bring up in discussing genetically modified crops. So biotechnology is also being used to create biofuels. So these are clean, renewable energy sources that are produced from plant materials like starch, cellulose, or ethanol. And so we have an experiment where your students can take a role as biofuel scientists and explore optimization of ethanol production using baker's yeast. And so baker's yeast will ferment sugar. Sugar creates ethanol, which is a critically important biofuel. By changing sugar, by changing temperature, aeration, you can optimize the growing conditions used to produce the most ethanol. And so clean water is also a major concern. So many industrial processes release wastewater, which is either going to be direct from a manufacturing plant. If we're talking about farming, there is indirect wastewater, which, like wastewater that's going to flow from a farm, which is going to contain animal byproducts, namely poop. But that poop is going to contain nitrates and phosphates and bacteria that are harmful for the local environment. Livestock also produces a lot of methane from the natural digestive processes of the cows. So cow burps are actually a big contributor of methane gas. And so how can we use biotechnology to make microbes to help us clean the water? How can we use biotechnology to test what's polluting the water? And how can we use biotechnology to change the animals themselves? So there is an animal called the EnviroPig, which was basically genetically engineered to reduce the amount of nitrates in their byproducts. And so we got a question, are there any applications of biofuel in the automobile industry? In the United States, ethanol, a biofuel, is actually used in a lot of commercially available gas, gasoline. So this is added, seasonally, depending on where you are, and up to about 10%, I believe. This is basically reducing the amount of fossil fuel that goes into the cars. There are also cars that, interestingly, that can run on fryer oil. So this is not a scaled up technology yet, but there are individuals that have retrofitted diesel engines to be able to use cooking oil and frying oil from food waste and repurpose it into fuel for their cars. And from what I understand is if you're near one of those cars, it smells like French fries because they're burning, the oil that has been used to cook, different foods. Okay, so these are some ways that green biotechnology can be used to combat climate change. But we ourselves can also take actions to affect the environment. And so, we can calculate our carbon handprint to address climate change. So what you would do in the classroom would be to review the carbon handprint calculations and to choose an action to reduce our carbon emissions. And so using this, we'll calculate the number of mitigation drops to mitigate our positive impact on the environment. And so one thing I personally tried to do is to reduce food waste. So when I cook, I keep my food scraps. If I am cooking carrots, I peel those carrots and I save those in a freezer. And when I have a large number of these food scraps, I use them to make stock. I have an electric pressure cooker. I put them all in there with some onions and some bay leaves. I create vegetable stock, which I then use in my cooking. I'd also like to learn more about composting in my community. I don't have a space to have a personal compost pile, but our community recycling center does compost household waste. So using this carbon handprint, I can add 12 mitigation drops to our community atmosphere. Now, James Bond really has to address a lot of different parts of his carbon usage, but one thing he can do is discuss energy efficient vehicles with Q, which would give 9 drops. And so he really should reduce the number of times he flies per year, but that's just not possible with the spy lifestyle. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my classroom atmosphere. My classroom atmosphere, again, is the mixture of my atmosphere and James Bond's atmosphere. And I'm going to add this mitigation solution. So I have 9 drops from James Bond. I have 12 drops from myself, so it's 21 drops. And we are going to add that here to our classroom sample. All right, and I'm going to do that off screen because it's hard to get under there. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. All right, so I've got 21 in there. Recap our tubes, of course. All right, recap our tube. Here is our classroom atmosphere. I'm going to move our classroom atmosphere, 1 ml of it, into a fresh tube Now, one thing you may notice is that we do use a lot of plastics. So that is one caveat of science, in that there is a lot of disposable plastic used. But Edvotek actually does take measures to reduce the amount of waste. So again, we are going to provide we provide our kits in concentrates so that we're not shipping large amounts of liquid, of solid, of liquid around. We use recycled paper boxes, so that we are using paper that has been used before and recycled. And one thing that was a big change for us about 8 years ago, is that we actually started moving to having PDF guides for our experiments instead of paper copies of manuals. And so I think the calculation was that we saved something like 20,000 reams of paper per year, by moving to a PDF where you can print out just the pages that you need. All right, so I added the mitigation drops to the classroom atmosphere. I transferred 1 ml to a clean 1.5 ml tube, and I am going to add our color change solution to this tube, to see what the effects of our mitigation steps have been. All right. And so what I hope you can see is that it's subtle, but here we have our original environment. Let me go to here. We have our original environment here. We have my sample. We have James Bond's sample. And then our classroom, all of us together. And so you can see the different colors. And so through the addition of the mitigation solution, what you can see is we moved from this kind of orange solution. So kind of, I think we would classify this as like an O1, which is that 3.5 degrees centigrade, increase by 2020. And we're kind of more at a Y2 or a Y1. So by taking these actions, we've actually reduced our carbon footprint. And so there was a question in the chat as the difference between a carbon handprint and a carbon footprint. And so a footprint is the negative effects that we have on the environment through our carbon emission. A handprint is the opposite. It's the positive effects that we take by changing our actions to reduce the amount of carbon that we're putting into the environment. And so the handprint refers to the beneficial environmental impacts that we can take to reduce the number of carbon emissions that we're putting out. And so in the chat, there's a great point that's made. A carbon handprint is the reduction of the carbon footprint. Okay, so these tubes kind of show us our effects on our personal environments, on the global environment, the community environment, but then also the steps that we can take to mitigate that change. And so, as I mentioned, green biotechnology is a growing field, and there's a lot of STEM jobs in green biotechnology. And so agriculture is a big area. So we discussed some of these areas before, but agricultural biotechnology companies are going to create tools for farmers that would like to increase the yield of plant and animal products while lowering the costs of production. If a food crop can produce more in a smaller area of land, then we're encroaching on fewer of the naturally occurring environments, and we're impacting our local environment less. Agricultural biotechnology can also include the production of plants that can be used to create biofuels. And so ethanol is a place where, crops are often used as a source to create ethanol for biofuels. And so renewable energy is going to focus on the development of clean energy sources. This could be wind, solar, this can be biofuels again. And so a lot of these people will have at least a bachelor's degree in an engineering field like mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, chemical engineering, bioengineering, as well as a certification from a state or local licensing board. And then we talked about wastewater earlier. So wastewater scientists are going to work with biotechnology to develop processes to remove pollutants and to improve water treatment. And so one area where this is important is in biofuels, biofilms, pardon me. And so biofilms are actually being developed as filters for water, in countries where large water processing plants might not be available. And so I hope that, and so, if you're interested in the environment and you want to make an impact, but you're also a science-minded person, there's a lot of ways that you can affect change. So I hope we can end this on a happy note. That the actions we take today can help to start the process of reducing the impact of our daily lives on the environment. So together we can work to change our lifestyles to reduce the production of greenhouse gas. So human activity, as I mentioned, is going to impact the climate through the production of these greenhouse gases. And through actions that we can take, both personally, through addressing our consumption and thinking about our life, not only in the amount of consumption, but in the ways that we can reduce that consumption and really improve our carbon footprint. So not only through my example, which was food waste, but in changing our diet to a more plant-based diet, to reducing the amount of air travel that we take, even local travel. If you can walk somewhere or use a bicycle as opposed to driving, you should always try to take advantage of, those modes of transportation that are not going to be increasing the carbon footprint. And, these are also very healthy for us as well, in terms of our physical health. And so these are important. And so there are steps we can take to mitigate these problems at every level: local, state, country, and global. So we can also look at our manufacturing processes. We can look at the production of renewable energy so that we're not, mining and tearing up the environment in locations. And so, these are all areas that are important for mitigating climate change. And so green biotechnology is going to use biological tools to create solutions that are going to benefit our environment as well. And we talked about a few of those. And if you want to explore those more in depth, we do have experiments that we offer at www.edvotek.com that you can use to link with this experiment to start talking about ways that biotechnology can be used to mitigate climate change. And so that brings us to the end of this workshop. We will be posting the presentation and the slides in the next few days to our website. So if you're interested, please be sure to fill out the form. I just put the link in the chat window. And this form, will email you the slides and let you know when this recording is available. So thank you so much for your time. If there are any other questions, I can take them right now. Otherwise, we will wrap up. I do like a couple other areas that we can think about in terms of reducing our carbon footprint. And so that would be increasing our carbon handprint. One thing that we can do is recycle, reuse, repurpose. Upcycling is very popular if you're a crafter. So other things that we can do, is if you have clothing that has been damaged, you can reuse that fabric to make something else. And you don't even have to buy a new product. Thrift stores are very popular, both for the, interesting fashions you can find, but also for the fact that you are not necessarily creating a new product that that has to be shipped to you, that has to be manufactured. Another way we can affect climate change is to communicate with your government officials. So this is at the local, state, and national level. So if there's a climate issue that you are particularly invested in, email your elected representatives. That is a way that you can impact policy that will affect the climate. If there aren't any other questions, we will wrap up. I just want to say thank you so much for your time. I'm very glad you joined me today for this experiment. Again, it's a little bit different from the ones we normally run. Okay, so we did get one question. So in what ways microbes can be used to diminish pollution? And so one thing that's really interesting that I have heard about recently is, using microbes to degrade plastic. Now, microorganisms are basically, the most resilient, adaptable critters, on the planet. They are everywhere. They're on our skin. They are in our stomachs. They are in our landfills. And they are going to look to get carbon anywhere that they can. And so if we think about carbon, again, those microorganisms are going to find a way to do it. And so one thing we can do is to, and is being done, is that, we can create biodegradable plastics and then also adapt a microorganism that can eat that plastic and reduce that resource there. So in addition to recycling, we can take those microbes, break down the plastic, and then we're not putting as much into the environment. So again, to request the presentation, please be sure to fill out the form, the Google form that I have linked into this presentation. And you can always get in touch with us. We answer the phones at 1-800-EDVOTECH. All of our resources are available on our website. We will be posting this video and the slides to our website as well. And we are always available by email at info@edvotech.com. This video and others are posted at our YouTube channel. And then be sure to follow us by social media for special offers and updates. And so we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, and again, we're on YouTube, which is where we are today. So thank you again. I'm glad you enjoyed your time here. And I look forward to seeing you for our next biotechnology live stream. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you soon.